Okay, welcome back. In this final video lecture, we'll cover the role of HIM professionals with data management. All right, 1 minute, please. Here we go. So we talked about the role of data management. One of the unique things about being an HIM professional versus being a programmer analyst is we can look at these issues of data management from several different perspectives: a legal perspective, ethical perspective, policy, and best practices in terms of, is this feasible, right? And in a lot of ways, it's critical for us to be at the table when these big decisions are made. Data quality ensures that the information that's going into a patient's electronic health record is reliable, it's accurate, and has integrity to support patient care. It supports patient safety, and it provides evidence for reimbursement, accreditation, and supports the basis for quality improvement. AHIMA's data quality management model domains are the applications, the collection, the warehousing, and the analysis. So again, this gives you some more things about some of the data quality management models. Data needs to be accurate, right? It needs to be accessible. No matter how accurate or useful the data is, if we can't get at it, it doesn't really help us. It needs to be comprehensive, it needs to be consistent, needs to be current, needs to be defined, right? It needs to be precise, relevant, and timely. And related to that is clinical documentation integrity. Basically, clinical documentation integrity gives us improved documentation so we can code more accurately and code at the highest level of specificity. Some clinical documentation integrity goals include obtaining specific documentation so we can accurately identify the patient's severity of illness. We can identify anything that's missing, conflicting, or unclear. This supports accurate coding, which therefore supports accurate reimbursement. This facilitates health record completion, improves communication amongst providers, facilitates education, and ultimately improves the quality of care. CDI queries are communication tools for CDI staff to communicate with a provider. In an electronic health record system like Epic, these might be inboxes, the same type of electronic inboxes where lab results and imaging reports show up. We can put queries in. In a paper-based world, we can do paper queries. And basically, it's a documentation alert that's asking for clarification. When we do these types of things, we need to have data collection tools. Typically, these are electronic and they support both structured data and unstructured data. Unstructured is text fields where people just freely type whatever it is. Structured data is exactly that. It's more structured. You can only put in the date in this format. And again, this gets back to some of the things you've heard about in earlier classes with forms design and forms control. More and more clinical documentation improvement and integrity efforts are going to be concurrent, meaning that we're going to be looking to improve the documentation while the patient's still in house versus retrospective when we review the records after they've gone home or been discharged. So whether it's concurrent or retrospective, we're reviewing the medical information, we're reviewing the documentation for anything that's conflicting, non-specific, incomplete, so we can be more specific and then code it more accurately. Some of the things that we look at with clinical documentation integrity is the legibility, the reliability, the precision, the completeness, the consistency, the clarity, and the timeliness. All these things that are very similar to data integrity. And again, what do we do with CDI? We basically do a lot of auditing, a lot of queries, and then we run reports. And some of these reporting areas, things that we include in the reports, are the discharges available, and the numerator being the discharges reviewed for CDI. Set the number of queries by a provider and the impact on DRGs, the number of queries resulting in a severity of illness change, and so on. And CDI education is basically, in other words, we collect all this data from our CDI efforts, and then we go to provider education. We did a lot of this in some healthcare organizations where I worked with, where we basically talked to the providers about the importance about saying what type of diabetes it is, right? And what types of manifestations, right? Especially with the HCC model, this is a big, big deal. And under the standards at that time, it would affect your reimbursement. Getting close to the very end of this, but we still have a couple important points. And one of them is data management and bylaws. Basically, these are like any other bylaws, they're rules that everybody agrees to follow about data management. So basically, in other words, this is going to cover all the rules about collecting, storing, and transmitting and assuring that we have high quality data. Common types of bylaws that are used. Let's take a look at this because this is something you will be seeing more of in your professional lifetime. Provider contracts with facilities, right? So basically, this is everything that's expected of a provider as they care for a patient in a particular practice or hospital, right? And then related to that, medical staff bylaws. This describes the manner that providers practice medicine, right? If you have a hospital, you have medical staff bylaws. And finally, we have hospital bylaws, kind of the same thing, but it covers the hospital staff members who create data. So let's talk about the nitty-gritty and how these roles are evolving. In the present tense, we have information governance managers, we have clinical data specialists, we have health data analysts, we have health informatics specialists. What's we're evolving to, we have data quality analyst, we have data governance managers, we have chief health informatics officers, and chief data officers. And that's all I have for you. Please reach out and either see me during office hours or book an appointment with me if you have any questions about this material. Thanks for watching. We'll see you online. Bye now.